Our theme for this evening is energetic presence, meaning your vibe. What's the energy that you put out when you're connecting with another person? Be it a group, someone in your family, a big presentation, something on Toastmasters. How present are you? It's an important thing to be aware of. So we're going to be exploring that, and the word of the day, which our grammarian will also ask you to look out for its usage, the word of the day is vitality. So the gentleman who has plenty of vitality to share with us today is Achim Nowak. I met Achim. I first got acquainted with him in 2014. We were both members of a Google Plus talent development interest group. But it was on Facebook that our common poignant experiences in caring for our elders is where we made a connection. And I came to learn about the depth of his heart, his caring. More recently, I got to know him well at a mastermind-like retreat in Florida, no less. He's quite an amazing and eclectic gentleman. He is the author of 3 books, all of which are relevant to us. Power Speaking, Infectious, and In the Moment. There you go. In 2004, he began his service to others with his company, Influence, a coaching and training company. More recently, he's provided his services to C-suite executives, coaches, consultants, those people who are really wanting to dive into the nuances of personal expression, personal magnetism, and meaningful impact in communications with others. He is going to be addressing us on this thing about gestures, and it was this article, "When you pitch an idea, gesture please." When I ran across that a few months ago, I thought, I think Achim has something very valuable to share, and he agreed to join us here for a presentation and a conversation. And with that, I turn the space over to Achim Nowak. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everybody. I'm sort of overwhelmed by how many of you are here, overwhelmed in a good way, and all the amazing places that you come from. To the Floridians, I'm in Hollywood, Florida, so I'm a neighbor to a bunch of you. But by my name, you can probably tell I'm originally from Germany, so I'm very much an international soul. Nick, I'm going to try to keep my comments to 5 minutes because I'm much more interested in the conversation than hearing myself talk for too long. So if you want to give me a warning after 5 if I'm still talking, that would be great. I remember as a German boy getting all sorts of messages from my mother about how expressive or not expressive I should be. One thing she always said to me is, don't talk with your hands so much. Because I could tell that if I got a little too active in public, it made her really uncomfortable. And I'm mentioning this as what I heard from mom and dad. I'm sure every single one of you got explicit or implicit messages from your parents about how expressive they wanted you to be. As somebody, because I coach, successful C-suite executives now, there are 2 myths I hear all the time that I want to address right away. One is this thing about introversion versus extraversion, like extroverted people can just gesture more freely and introverted people really just don't like to gesture. Number one, I don't believe that. And number two, I think it's a belief that's completely not helpful. There's a term floating around called ambivert, which I really like. It means all of us have the capability of moving between introversion, extroversion, and how we express. I used to be an acting coach in New York many moons ago before I did other stuff, and actors go to acting class to work on their range. So part of what I believe we all want to have is we want to have a range where we can express when necessary, but also pull back when it's time to pull back. The other item that was already mentioned, I'm glad you addressed it, is that different cultures have different norms around how many gestures we should use. And I believe there's lots of truth to it. Because I, however, coach mostly in multinational global corporations. I love that we have our colleague from Shanghai here. I've done a lot of work in Shanghai. There is this emergent global communication language. So if you're working globally at all, and for better or for worse, I would say the global standard that's emerging if you're in an international business is that that your style is relaxed and conversational rather than too formal, and that you are expressive, which means some gestures. We've all gotten lots of messages about when gesturing is too much, and that's a conversation we can have later. But whether we like it or not, there's a global expectation if we're in an international corporation that's how we show up and that we're warm and approachable. Now you showed this article that I wrote about gestures that prompted you to invite me. So I want to dig a little deeper. I was doing, I like to read Harvard Business Review, which it's tricky because it's very brainy and sometimes Western biased in the research that it quotes. But in the May-June issue of last year, they were quoting some research done by a researcher named Joop Cornelissen at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, who did some research on the expressiveness of presenters. I'm not going to explain the whole research. Basically, he said is people that gestured more are 12% more impactful. And we might go, gosh, 12%, that isn't that much. What does that really mean? But in a competitive situation, especially when folks are choosing between one person or another, 12% can make a big difference. What really grabbed my attention, he broke down gestures into different types and used language I had never heard that I got actually very excited about. So I want to share that language with you, just for your own contemplation. He said there are things called beat gestures. And beat gestures means we emphasize certain things repetitively, like I'm doing right now. That would be a beat gesture, according to Cornelissen. That he talks about speech structuring gestures, meaning we say something and we emphasize the end of something. And we begin again and we emphasize the end of something. So we use gestures to emphasize the structure of our speech. Third, that I think we know mostly, he calls them symbolic gestures, which is my heart is open to you. And when I do that, I gesture to my heart and my heart pours out to you. I love you so much, and my gesture matches that. And the fourth one are illustrative gestures, which many of you know from storytelling. Like I picked up a bucket and I put it over here, and the gesture demonstrates what I'm doing. I loved this breakdown because without having heard this, one thing I always said about myself, I use the term stereo gesturing. Meaning when I gesture, both hands like to do the same thing at the same time. And coaches said to me, will you just stop moving both hands at the same time? It's okay to just move one. And that was really great advice. But naturally, I want to move both at the same time. So it's really interesting to put some language on it that I really hadn't heard before. Let me end with this anecdote. There's some other research done actually at MIT, and I just remembered this before I logged on, but I wanted to share it. There are researchers named Sandy Pentland and Daniel Olguin. Pentland is a professor at MIT, and he did research on something he calls honest signals. And again, before his research, I had never heard the term honest signals. And Pentland says, honest signals are the sort of gestures, maybe it's not language, it's all gestures, movements, signals that are emblematic of humans. And he breaks it down like physical gestures, like I'm doing right now, but honest signals are how much we smile, how much our face moves, how close we move to people, how much we sweat, like all of these physical signals that we emit. And the experiment, which was really startling, they had a bunch of people at a cocktail party, and these folks were going to later do a competitive pitch to a bunch of investors who want to give them money for a project. And they watched the individuals at the cocktail party, and they said, without knowing their presentations, they said, we know who's going to win the pitch. And they correctly predicted the pitch. So when I read the interviewers asked Sandy Pentland, so what was the differentiating factor? Like, how did you know who's going to win the pitch? And this very much matches the work that our colleagues in Rotterdam, he said, is personal energy, which is really where Elaine started. So I'm going to stop here. I have a gazillion other things to talk about, but I want to shut myself up because I'm really interested in a dialogue with you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elaine.
Quick question for member Patty and Bruce Adams. Can you repeat the third gesturing type? Was that symbolic?
The third one was symbolic, meaning if you say to somebody, my heart goes out to you, I do a gesture that shows my heart goes out to you. So it obviously, I'm using symbolic languages now. My heart goes out to you, but physically I am sort of matching the symbolic language I'm using. And I think many of us are familiar with that one, but I like to just know what the word is.
I'd like to now turn this on over to John Quick to either read or call on some of the questioners who are putting some things in our chat. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. How about Christian from Mauritius? Can you share your question with us?
Sure thing, John. So, Achim, thank you for sharing. Here's my question. As we speak to people across different countries, from different cultures, how do we identify that our expressive gestures are too little or too much? Is there like rule of thumb? How do we proceed to know that we're just not going overboard or it's just too much? Thank you.
The biggest fear that I think I can say this most of us have is that we're gesturing too much and that it's going to drive people crazy. I always have to laugh. When I coach somebody, if I coach somebody from a so-called expressive culture, they usually tell me in advance, you know, I come from a culture where we use our hands a lot, and they tell me in advance like they want to warn me. And when they then present to me, I find that they have self-regulated so much that they're not expressive enough for my taste. I very rarely see presenters that gesture too much. So I would urge you, for our own development, let go of the idea that you are doing too much. Another thing related to it, because I love your question, people always say is, I just want the gestures to be natural. Some people naturally do nothing. And if you naturally do nothing, that's not enough in my mind as a coach. So, because I'm an acting coach formerly, I believe in working with range. So, but in the spirit of natural, let's say, if I was coaching you and you were working on a speech, I would watch your natural impulses. I wouldn't tell you, do this gesture on this or do this on that. I would watch to see where you're naturally gesturing. I would say, did you notice the gesture you just made? That's great. Can you do more of that? Could you make it a little larger? So I'm not going to impose things on you. I'm noticing what your body naturally wants to do. If I'm working with somebody who doesn't naturally gesture at all, which happens, I will say, give me 20% more of yourself. And people usually ask me, well, what do you mean by 20% more of yourself? And I say, it can be whatever you want it to be. And then they will do something. If it's not enough in my mind, I'd say that was 10%. Could you give me 20%? But what happens at some point, their body starts doing stuff, which means their natural expressive impulses become visible. And that's what I help people to find out. So the key is to notice how you want to express. I can't remember the last time I coached somebody that gestures too much. It just doesn't happen because we self-regulate so much in my experience.
Thanks, Achim. We have a series of questions from several members
Sure.
here about, as you can see, I'm standing now, limited by my wire, but most of the time we sit in the online environment.
Yeah.
What's your feeling about giving a speech sitting versus standing? And then generally, what percentage of the screen should we fill with ourselves? And obviously how close we are determines how much space we have. Can you respond to these thoughts, please?
I'm going to answer in a very personal way. When I stand, I do a lot more. My whole body and my gestures, which is not helpful in a video communication. So I'm going to sit myself down. I'm sitting at a desk right now. It anchors and grounds me and prevents me from doing too much. So for anchoring yourself in a medium where too much is not good, I think sitting down can be helpful. The one thing to work on, if you are more energetic when you stand, which many of us are, and if your energy goes down when you're sitting, is to really develop some muscle memory with what the right level of energy is when you're sitting. Common wisdom is gesture less when we're on video because it becomes magnified and can look like it's too much. So because I am a big gesturer, so what I do, like I have a little notebook in here that I have here. So sometimes I place my hands on it, which prevents me from doing this all the time. But I'm not, this is my bias as a coach, I don't believe in hard and fast rules about when it's too much, when it's not. I believe in self-monitoring. The nice thing is on video, we can watch ourselves. Like I just gestured for a moment and common sense is, okay, that's enough for now. Put the hands down for a while. I also, because I can gesture a lot, I literally give myself mental commands like hands down, which means I notice when I'm gesturing too much, I talk to myself to bring it down and then bring it back up.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
From Michael, one of our guests, he asks, how can you coach authenticity in gesture usage?
The only way I know how to do it is by working with what I mentioned, what you naturally want to do. But then again, if I was coaching you, John, since you and I are talking to each other right now, again, I will watch for what you're naturally doing, but then I would say is, can you make it 3 times as large? Just to see what that's like. And then I would ask you, how did that feel, John? On a scale of 1 to 10, you know, and so because I want you to remember what feels right for you. I'm here to help you remember to create your own muscle memory rather than mimic other people's gestures. You know, so my bias as a coach is to help you find what you naturally do, but then develop a range so you're not doing the same stuff all the time.
All right, thank you. And I think even for those of us without coaches then, the same response applies. Think about what you would normally do and then see how you can push yourself a little bit and see how effective it is and also how you feel about it.
But allow me quickly to build on that. If you don't have a coach, which is totally great, is if you have to do a 2-minute speech, you know, get a buddy who you trust, run it by that person, but let them know what kind of feedback you want, which is, I'm looking at how my gestures are. I'm afraid that they're too much. Would you watch? So you're letting your buddy know what you want her or him to watch for, and they'll be as helpful as a coach.
Good, thank you. Okay, Bhushan says, Well, I do a lot of Skype and Zoom meetings for work. Sometimes cameras are shut off. Is there something I can do to emphasize myself even if we don't have video feed?
I love the question. The answer obviously is to use more emphasis on words. I think in Toastmasters, you're already well trained on taking language seriously. Most people use language like fast food. They just throw it out and they don't really use it. But use more emphasis, overemphasize, work a little more with slowing down your pace, speeding up your pace. We call this the dynamics of speaking. That becomes more important in the absence of a visual. And really have some fun playing with that. I'll tell you a 30-second story because it illustrates my first really big client I coached was, he was the #2 person in UNESCO. I was living in New York at the time, and his wife knew me, and she said, my husband is a really horrible, boring speaker, and he has to speak in front of hundreds of people all the time. And I met her husband, and he was a really boring speaker. I had to concur with her. And I was going like, shoot, how do I help this guy? And he has such a wonderful message. UNESCO is a good cause. You talk about things that people care about. And with each person, I try to figure out what's the entry point that will help that individual be better. And with him, he was able to play with emphasis, like emphasizing, take a sentence, what are the 2 most important words to you? Can you emphasize those more? That's a simple request. And suddenly there was a dynamic and rhythm to his language where it was flat before. So those are very simple things that especially when the visual isn't there, become more important.
Hey, thank you. Lois, can you please share your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, John. One of the things we do in our club is we tell our members to try and keep their body language within frame. And I'm noticing that when you're giving your speech, you're going out here, your hands are coming up, they're coming up like this, they're going back. And that's something we've really been working our members with. So my question is, what should we be telling our members? Is it appropriate for our members to continuously say, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and then go outside the frame, or should we keep them inside the frame?
I think inside the frame is preferable. So I think you're saying the right stuff. In case of doubt in my coaching, I will always coach people beyond technique, which to me, that's a technique thing. And it's important, but in case of like, if somebody goes out of frame like I just did, for me, it's no big deal. I come back into frame. But so you're giving the right advice, but when somebody gets carried away, for example, I don't sweat that. The funny thing is, if this helps you, I coach a lot of people that are too polished. And when a corporation calls me, they usually say is, can you work with her or him on their executive presence? And they usually think I'm going to teach them some more rules to follow. And I usually unpack people, because they've already to package themselves too much. And so I can live with something technique-wise not being perfect as long as I get the spirit of the person. Like one thing I loved about you when you did the introductions, your spirit is really strong, and what you did was really hard to do. I mean, to keep the introductions moving. There are lots of people in the session, so because your spirit and energy was so warm and effervescent, and you were on it, if you mess up a gesture, big deal to me. But these are my biases as a coach.
Thank you. So all of you who keep telling me I go out, please make sure you heard Achim. Thank you, sir.
Hey, David, can you ask your question, please?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think you've given some of this along the way, but I was curious about how the kinds of gestures, the kind of body language that are appropriate in person and online are different. For example, how would the presentation you're delivering to us today be different if we were in the same room with you? what's your process of adapting that to this setting? And I'll just tag on one other thing is, a lot of what you're saying is that it's really the energy that you deliver that is more important than the specific techniques in some way. How do we project energy through a computer screen, through a little box here, and reach out and grab people that we're trying to connect with?
Well, I've been listening to you all, and I think you're doing collectively a fantastic job. So I'm just meeting you, but my sense of you is that you're probably, if I did a psychological profile, more of an introvert than an extrovert, but you're functioning really, really well as an extroverted person here. So you're energetically projecting probably more than you normally might, and you're doing it really well. My adaptation is, I loved your question. It was a cognitive question, but my adaptation is completely intuitive. What I work on with my clients, again, if you and I were working together, is because I used to be a theater director, I work with constant repetition. And at some point I would say is, do you remember how you just did that and how that felt? I believe that this was you at your best. Can you try that again? So the idea is that even when you're having a really crappy day and it's 7 in the morning, you didn't sleep well, and you have to give a speech, your body remembers what you need to do, which is different from doing it perfectly. Does that make sense? But your body, so I work with repetition and muscle memory with my clients, so the body knows what you do at your best.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Jim Barber.
Yes, thank you, John. I don't know if you have the time for this, but I would love to have more information about the 4 different types of gestures. I found that fascinating. And I was wondering, for example, is a particular gesture a better thing to do in a particular situation, that sort of thing?
The researcher himself, Mr. Cornelissen, doesn't do that. So he says we're prone to doing all of these and all of these at different times. So the coach in me would say, just be mindful of what you're doing, mix it up. For example, the beat gestures, first one, you can't do too many of those in a row. You're going to drive people nuts, right? So that's probably, you've seen people do that, like that's a beat gesture too much. If you're constantly doing symbolic gestures, somebody at some point will want to strangle you and want to haul you off stage, because good gesturing is fluid. And another term that's helpful when I coach people is resting positions. Like we gesture and then we go to a resting position. The example here was my notebook. I put my hands on it. That's my resting position. I'm not gesturing now, and so having a natural flow between going to your resting position and flowing and having an intuitive sense of what that is really helpful. And for many people, resting positions are harder than the gestures. Because you feel like I'm standing still, I'm not doing anything, I feel horrible, and doing something actually feels more comfortable than resting. So I don't know if I would urge you, like Elaine can send you the link to the article in Harvard Business Review. I think she has already done that, that I just extrapolated from, but that article is worth reading, and it was really interesting research to me. May-June issue of Harvard Business Review from last year.
Thanks, that was great.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks everybody for your questions. We've run out of time. We tried to get to as many people as possible. I'll highlight the questions we didn't get to in the chat so we can think about them again. And now let's go back to Toastmaster Elaine.
Hi, everyone. What great conversation. The dynamics and flow in this meeting has been different than anything I've experienced in online presenters before. It's great to know we can do this.